if we get the training stimulus right, and we agree there's different ways of approaching it from a training perspective, what are the critical lifestyle components, to include nutrition, of course, that are going to play the biggest roles? They're going to be the sort of the biggest levers to pull on this process of achieving hypertrophy.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you mentioned nutrition is a huge component. Now, your resistance training is the king of hypertrophy. You can eat a lot, and eating in itself is anabolic, particularly, certainly when you include protein, have sufficient protein in there. If you're going to be in a caloric surplus, you will gain weight and you will gain some muscle along with that. But the majority, if you're not resistance training, of that weight gain will be in the form of fat. Whereas if you then add resistance training into it, you can reverse that and have the majority gain from muscle. But protein, the quantity of protein, having sufficient protein, having really achieving a critical threshold of protein intake is really important. Being in a caloric surplus is important for maximizing the response. And again, we can get into this more. To some extent, the types of fats there's some evidence that certain types of fats, particularly omega-3 fats, have signaling effects. They create greater fluidity in the outside of the cell, in the cellular membrane, and thus allow for greater transmission of signaling, creating that intracellular cascade that I mentioned. Rest is going to be really important. So there's critical amounts of sleep that I think need to be achieved, but there's not a critical. People try to say you need 7 to 8 hours of sleep, and there's very little evidence that that's the case. I think those are general guidelines, but there's an individual component to it, and people can subsist on more or less. I think it's pretty safe to say that if someone's just sleeping 1 to 2 hours, they're going to be compromising their rejuvenative capacity. But if they're getting 5 hours sleep versus 7, we don't have any clear evidence that. I think that would be somewhat individual based on other factors, and job lifestyle will enter into that. Stress is going to be a factor as well. Again, not a lot of empirical evidence, but heavy amounts of mental stress, distress. So there's a difference between eustress, which is quote unquote good stress, and distress. But if you're under a lot of distress, which would produce catabolic hormones, particularly cortisol, we're not clear on the effects of that, but certainly I think there's at least a good logical rationale. So yeah, many lifestyle factors. You have to look at the difference between lifestyle factors and your imposed factors.